Something massive shifted in the Middle East, and most Americans never got the full story. The Persian Gulf War wasn't just a military operation, it was a geopolitical earthquake that rewired power, money, and loyalty across an entire region. Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. These aren't just names on a map, they sit on the arteries of global oil, and whoever controls that geography controls the economic bloodstream of the modern world. What you were told about this war was a fraction of what actually happened. The real story lives in the power structures that were protected, the alliances that were quietly cemented, and the moral framework that was conveniently constructed to justify it all. If you want to understand why the world looks the way it does today, why certain regimes survive, why borders hold or break, why America keeps returning to this region, this is where that answer begins. Let's go back to August 2nd, 1990. That's the date Saddam Hussein ordered Iraqi forces to cross the border into Kuwait. Within hours, a country the size of New Jersey was swallowed by its neighbor. The images were stark: tanks rolling through streets, Kuwaiti citizens fleeing, a government in exile, and within days the United States began assembling one of the largest military coalitions the world had seen since World War II. But before we talk about what happened militarily, we need to talk about what was actually at stake. Because this war was never simply about one country invading another. It was about the architecture of power in one of the most strategically loaded regions on the planet. To understand why Kuwait mattered so deeply, you have to understand what Kuwait is. This small country sitting at the northwestern tip of the Persian Gulf holds some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. In 1990, it was producing roughly 2 million barrels of oil per day. When Iraq seized Kuwait, Saddam Hussein didn't just gain territory, he gained leverage. Suddenly, Iraq controlled roughly 20% of the world's known oil reserves between its own fields and those it had just occupied. And Saudi Arabia, sitting right next door, began to tremble, because if Saddam moved further south, he would have a stranglehold on nearly half of the world's oil supply. That is not a regional problem, that is a global crisis. Now let's talk about Saudi Arabia for a moment, because the Saudi decision to invite American troops onto its soil was one of the most consequential decisions in modern Middle Eastern history. Saudi Arabia is not just an oil producer, it is the custodian of Islam's two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. For centuries, the legitimacy of the Saudi royal family has been wrapped in its role as the protector of those sacred places. So when King Fahd agreed to allow hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to station themselves on Saudi soil, he was making a calculated gamble. He was betting that the military threat from Iraq outweighed the religious and political backlash that would come from inviting a Western, non-Muslim military force into the Arabian Peninsula. That backlash came, it came hard, and one of the men who was most enraged by that decision was a Saudi national living in Afghanistan at the time, a man named Osama bin Laden. The seeds of what happened on September 11th, 2001 were planted in that very decision. That's how deeply interconnected these events are. You cannot separate the Gulf War from the world that followed it. But let's continue with the immediate story. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, began building what became known as Operation Desert Shield. The goal at first was defensive, protect Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states from further Iraqi aggression. Troops poured in from America, Britain, France, Egypt, Syria, and dozens of other nations. The coalition was remarkable not just for its size, but for its composition. You had Arab nations fighting alongside Western powers against another Arab nation. That dynamic tells you everything about how fractured the Arab world was, and frankly still is. Pan-Arab unity, which had been a political dream for decades, collapsed in real time as Egypt and Syria chose to stand with America against Baghdad. Now, why did Egypt participate? Why did Syria, which was itself no friend of American foreign policy, send troops to join this coalition? The answer is layered. Egypt needed American financial support and debt relief. Syria's Assad saw an opportunity to rehabilitate his regime's international standing. Every nation in that coalition had its own calculation. This was not a moral crusade, even though it was framed as one. It was a convergence of self-interests held together by American organizational power and the common fear of what a regionally dominant Iraq would mean for everyone else's position. Let's talk about Iraq's position for a moment. Saddam Hussein did not wake up one morning and randomly decide to invade Kuwait. There was a logic to his thinking, however catastrophically miscalculated it turned out to be. Iraq had just emerged from an 8-year war with Iran. A war, by the way, that the United States had actively supported Iraq in fighting. Washington provided intelligence, diplomatic cover, and looked the other way when Saddam used chemical weapons against Iranian forces and against his own Kurdish population. So Saddam had reason to believe he had a degree of American tolerance, perhaps even tacit approval, for aggressive regional moves. He also had a genuine grievance against Kuwait, at least one he could articulate publicly. He accused Kuwait of slant drilling into Iraqi oil fields along their shared border, effectively stealing Iraqi oil. He accused Kuwait of deliberately overproducing oil in violation of OPEC agreements, which was driving down the price of oil and strangling the Iraqi economy at a time when Iraq desperately needed revenue to rebuild after the Iran war. These weren't entirely fabricated claims. Kuwait had been overproducing. The slant drilling accusations had some basis, but using those grievances to justify a full military annexation of a sovereign country was a leap that the international community was not prepared to tolerate. There is also the famous meeting between Saddam Hussein and the American ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, which took place just days before the invasion. In that meeting, Glaspie told Saddam that the United States had no opinion on Arab-to-Arab conflicts. Saddam interpreted that as a green light. Whether it was an intentional signal or a catastrophic diplomatic blunder remains debated. But what is not debated is that Saddam walked away from that meeting believing America would not intervene. He was wrong, devastatingly wrong. The United Nations Security Council passed a series of resolutions demanding Iraqi withdrawal, and when diplomacy failed, the coalition moved from Desert Shield to Desert Storm. On January 17, 1991, the air campaign began. For 38 days, the most sophisticated air force in the history of warfare pounded Iraqi military positions, infrastructure, communication networks, and supply lines. Baghdad residents described the sky lighting up like a horrific electrical storm every single night. It was a display of American technological dominance unlike anything the world had witnessed in the television age. And the world was watching, literally. CNN was broadcasting it live. This was the first war fought in real time on television screens across America and across the globe. Then came the ground campaign. On February 24, 1991, coalition ground forces crossed into Kuwait and southern Iraq. The result was not a war in the traditional sense, it was a rout. Iraqi forces, already decimated by weeks of aerial bombardment, surrendered in massive numbers. Some units surrendered to journalists. The famous Highway of Death, the road between Kuwait City and Basra, became a graveyard of Iraqi military vehicles, and the soldiers inside them, as retreating Iraqi troops, were annihilated from the air. 100 hours after the ground campaign began, President Bush declared a ceasefire. Kuwait was liberated, Saddam Hussein's army was broken, and yet Saddam Hussein remained in power. That decision, to stop short of Baghdad, to leave Saddam Hussein in place, is one of the most analyzed and debated strategic choices in American foreign policy. General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of coalition forces, later expressed frustration about it. But the Bush administration had its reasons. Going to Baghdad would have meant exceeding the UN mandate, which authorized the liberation of Kuwait and nothing more. It would have fractured the coalition, particularly the Arab members who had no interest in watching American forces occupy an Arab capital, and it would have created exactly the kind of power vacuum that nobody in the region actually wanted, because a destroyed Iraq meant an empowered Iran, and nobody in that coalition, least of all Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, wanted to see Iran expand its regional influence, so Saddam stayed, and that decision set the stage for everything that came afterward: the sanctions, the no-fly zones, the weapons inspections, the Second Gulf War in 2003, and the catastrophic destabilization of the entire region that followed that invasion. Every piece connects. Now let's talk about the smaller Gulf states, because they are often reduced to footnotes in the larger narrative and they deserve far more examination. Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman each played distinct roles and each had distinct stakes in the outcome of this conflict. Bahrain, a tiny island nation sitting just off the Saudi coast, is home to the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet. Its strategic value is enormous, and in 1990 it served as a critical logistics hub for coalition operations. The Bahraini ruling family, the Al Khalifa, understood that their security was inseparable from American military presence in the Gulf, and the Gulf War only deepened that dependency. Qatar in 1990 was not yet the media and diplomatic powerhouse it would later become, but it too hosted coalition forces and allowed its territory to be used for military operations. The Gulf War accelerated Qatar's strategic relationship with the United States, and within a decade, Qatar would build the Al Udeid Air Base, which became the largest American military installation in the Middle East. Understanding why Qatar invested so heavily in hosting American military infrastructure makes no sense unless you understand what the Gulf War demonstrated: that small, wealthy states sitting next to large, aggressive neighbors need a guarantor, and America was willing to be that guarantor in exchange for access, basing rights, and energy cooperation. The UAE, a federation of 7 emirates only unified since 1971, also contributed forces to the coalition and allowed its ports and airfields to be used. The Emirates, particularly Abu Dhabi and Dubai, had enormous wealth tied up in oil and were acutely aware of how quickly that wealth could become a target. The Gulf War reinforced the UAE's commitment to building a relationship with Western security frameworks, a relationship that has deepened every decade since. Oman, sitting at the southeastern corner of the Arabian Peninsula and controlling the Strait of Hormuz alongside Iran, occupied perhaps the most quietly strategic position of all. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes. Oman's Sultan Qaboos, one of the most sophisticated geopolitical operators in the Arab world, had long maintained a unique position, maintaining quiet relations with Iran, even while aligning with the West and the Gulf Cooperation Council. Oman provided logistical support to coalition forces and allowed use of its military facilities, but it also maintained back-channel communications that would prove valuable in later years when secret negotiations between the United States and Iran quietly began on Omani soil. The Gulf War, in other words, did not make Oman simply a footnote. It confirmed Oman's value as a discrete and essential player in regional diplomacy. And then there is Iran. Iran's position during the Gulf War is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated dimensions of the entire conflict. Here you had a country that had fought a brutal, devastating 8-year war against Iraq, a war in which over 1 million people died. And now it watched as a massive American-led coalition dismantled the Iraqi military that had tormented it for nearly a decade. Iran officially declared neutrality. It did not join the coalition, it did not support Iraq, it simply watched, and it quietly received over 100 Iraqi military aircraft that Saddam Hussein flew across the border into Iran to protect them from destruction, aircraft that Iran promptly kept and never returned. Iran's calculated neutrality during the Gulf War was itself a form of strategic gain. A weakened Iraq meant a more powerful Iran by default, even without firing a single shot. What the Gulf War also did, and this is something that rarely gets discussed in the mainstream American conversation, is that it locked in a security architecture for the Persian Gulf that persists to this day. The war established, permanently and visibly, that the United States was the ultimate security guarantor for the Gulf monarchies. In exchange for that guarantee, the Gulf states maintained dollar-denominated oil pricing, the petrodollar system, kept their sovereign wealth funds heavily invested in American financial markets, and hosted American military bases that project force across the entire region. This was not charity. This was a structured arrangement that benefited multiple parties, and the Gulf War was the moment that arrangement was written in fire and made undeniable. The human cost of this war is something that also demands acknowledgement. Coalition military casualties were remarkably low given the scale of the operation, fewer than 400 killed in action for the entire coalition. Iraqi military casualties are estimated in the tens of thousands, though precise figures remain disputed. Kuwaiti civilians suffered enormously under Iraqi occupation. There were documented cases of looting, torture, and summary executions. And as Iraqi forces retreated, they set fire to over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells in an act of scorched earth vengeance that created an environmental catastrophe of historic proportions. The sky above Kuwait turned black for months. The fires burned for nearly a year before they were all extinguished. That image of a country's wealth literally burning against a black sky is as close to a perfect visual metaphor for this entire conflict as anything you will find. What emerged from the Gulf War was a Middle East that looked stable on the surface but was structurally loaded with contradictions and unresolved tensions. Saddam was contained but not gone. Iran was weakened but regrouping. The Gulf monarchies were secure but dependent. American troops were now permanently embedded in the region, which created its own set of political and religious backlash dynamics. The Kurdish and Shia populations inside Iraq, who had risen up against Saddam following the war at what they believed was American encouragement, were brutally crushed when that American encouragement turned out to be rhetorical rather than real. Those communities paid with their lives for a promise that was never actually made explicitly, but was certainly implied. The Persian Gulf War is the pivot point on which so much of the modern Middle East turns. Every subsequent crisis, on the sanctions era, the no-fly zones, the weapons of mass destruction debate, the 2003 invasion, the rise of ISIS, the Iranian nuclear program, the Yemeni civil war, the Qatar diplomatic crisis, the Abraham Accords, all of it traces a line back to the choices made and the structures built in and around 1990 and 1991. You cannot understand where this region is today without standing at that pivot point and looking carefully in all directions.